Hello, my name is Pastor Kong Jin Ai. Welcome to today's discussion on Dorje Shugden and sectarianism. One of the accusations is that Dorje Shugden's practice encourages sectarianism. It is inferred that his practice promotes bigotry and superiority over other traditions, and that the lamas who engage in Shugden practice are directly involved in encouraging disharmony and schism between the sects. Critics of Dorje Shugden claim that his practice promotes the Gelug tradition at the expense of everything else. I'm joined here today by Pastor David Lai and Martin Chow to discuss these accusations. So, Pastor David, let's talk about Dorje Shugden and his true nature as Manjushri. Can the Buddhas be sectarian?
No, I don't think that the Buddhas can be sectarian. Just look back in history, and you look back to the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni. He taught 84,000 sets of teachings, and they were meant for different sets of disciples, for different mindsets. And each mindset, each set of students, they take a set of Buddhist teachings and they practice it, and with the exclusion of other sets of teachings, because they wanted to focus on a particular school or set of teachings from the Buddha in order to gain attainments, in order to become a Buddha. So they are not considered sectarian. Likewise, in the Nyingma tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, they practice Guru Rinpoche, and their focus is on Guru Rinpoche. They do not necessarily practice they do not worship Lama Tsongkhapa. So that doesn't mean that they are sectarian. Likewise, in the Gelug school, they worship Lama Tsongkhapa and practice his teachings. That's not considered sectarian just because they focus on his teachings in order to gain attainments, in order to become a Buddha. Also, when you look at the essence and the nature of Buddhas, which is accepted in all schools of Buddhism, the Buddhas are basically, their nature is wisdom and compassion. So they cannot be sectarian because they have equanimity, they have compassion for all beings. And sectarianism is not something that's considered part of the teachings of Lord Buddha in terms of compassion. So it is impossible that the Buddhas are sectarian.
So what you're saying, Pastor David, is that different schools focus on different practices, and this does not necessarily reflect their nature as being sectarian. When we talk about our practices, these come from our lineage masters, they come from our teachers. So should there be any kind of accusations of sectarianism, then theoretically, technically, one could say that the responsibility for sectarianism lies with our lineage masters. So Martin, since we're talking about Dorje Shugden and its accusations that have been directed against it by critics of the practice as being sectarian, then we need to discuss its current status as a Gelug practice. Can the Gelug lineage lamas be sectarian?
No, Pastor Jinai, that would be quite impossible actually, because to say that Dorje Shugden masters are sectarian would mean that they reject any identification with masters who are non-Gelugpas. The deity Dorje Shugden itself has past lives, past reincarnations, past incarnations that were non-Gelugpas. In the past lives, Dorje Shugden was the great Sakya Pandita, who was a Sakya master. And then he was also the great Bhutan Rinchen Drup, who definitely was not Gelugpa, and yet compiled both the Kagyu and the Tengyu, which remains used by people of all lineages since then. So he didn't compose anything exclusively for the Gelugpas, but two very, very important sets of texts, which is used by students and lamas and monks of all lineages. So you see that it's very impossible for Dorje Shugden masters to be sectarian when the deity itself is clearly non-sectarian. And when we talk about the Dorje Shugden lineage, we must consider a very important figure who is the Mahasiddha Thakpupema Vajra, who was the first to transmit the Dorje Shugden practice. And again, Thakpupema Vajra had other lives which were also non-Gelugpa. Now, more recently, we see that His Holiness Babongka Rinpoche wrote texts that clearly indicated that he was against any form of sectarianism and placed very, very great importance, or rather he cautioned all practitioners not to be selective, to say that I prefer this lineage or that lineage. Now, and even more recently, we come to His Holiness Trijang Rinpoche, who is definitely non-sectarian. And at one time, when His Holiness Trijang Rinpoche was at Chatreng, he gave Jenang, or permission initiations, on the two forms of Padmasambhava, which is the peaceful as well as the wrathful form. And in addition, he also gave some Nyingma empowerments. Now, His Holiness Trijang Rinpoche even gave Nyingma oral transmissions to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So we see that it's impossible to say that Dorje Shugden Lamas are sectarian at all.
Okay, so let me recap what you're saying, Martin. You mentioned earlier that Dorje Shugden himself, in his previous incarnations, was non-Gelug Lamas. Then you had also mentioned that the Lamas, the Gelug Lamas who propitiate and promote the practice of Dorje Shugden, they themselves have promoted and spread and given initiations and transmissions of practices that are not traditionally associated with the Gelug lineage. So let's go on and talk about the practice of Dorje Shugden itself. Now, I have heard and I've been told that the Dorje Shugden liturgy prayers, which are used to invoke and which praise Dorje Shugden, have had contributions from masters of non-Gelug backgrounds, of non-Gelug traditions. Is this true, Martin?
Oh, definitely true, Pastor Jinai. The Dorje Shugden Council that we are using today has parts of it that have been derived from texts and liturgies written by Sakya masters and also Kagyu masters, Drupa Kagyu to be precise, which is not uncommon because in fact Dorje Shugden was practiced not only by the Gelugpas but also by the Sakyas, the Kagyus, and I've also heard the Nyingmas because there are evidence that the Nyingma did also practice Dorje Shugden.
All right, Martin. So let's talk about the background and history of Dorje Shugden's practice in the Sakya tradition. Now, the Sakyas first described Dorje Shugden and depicted him as riding on a black horse. And in fact, it was Morchen Kunga Hundrup who first described Dorje Shugden as being seated on a lion throne. Is there anything about this that you can elaborate on, Martin?
Yes. Morchen Kunga Lundrup was a very important figure to the Sakyas. And in fact, Morchen Kunga Lundrup regarded Dorje Shugden as an enlightened being. He was the one who in fact wrote the Dorje Shugden Council used by the Sakyas in their worship of Dorje Shugden. His Holiness Pabongka Rinpoche would later on use parts of what Morchen Kunga Lundrup wrote, the empowerment and the praise to Dorje Shugden, for the Dorje Shugden Council that we are using today. Later on, the 30th Sakya Trinzin, Sonam Rinchen, would induct Dorje Shugden into the Sakya pantheon of Dharma Protectors. He placed Dorje Shugden together with Dorje Satrap and Chui Mapo, and collectively they were known as the Three Kings, or Gyalpo Sum, which were the main Dharma Protectors to the Sakyas.
Thank you, Martin, for your answer. Pastor David, is there anything you wish to add to this?
Yes, I do. The 31st Sakya Trinzin, or the Sakya throne holder, Kunga Lodro, received all Dorje Shugden transmissions from his father, Sonam Rinchen, which was mentioned by Martin earlier. And also this Sakya Trinzin, the 31st, Kunga Lodro, he's also incarnation of Dorje Shugden. And he combined both the lineages from his fathers, Sonam Rinchen, and also the High Lama Morchen Kunga Lundrup, together into one fulfillment puja text to Dorje Shugden. And also he composed this Raffle Toma offering called the Swirl of Perfect Sense Offerings.
Pastor David, you mentioned the 31st Sakya Trinzin, Sachen Kunga Lodro, and actually it was this great master who first taught about the 5 families of Dorje Shugden and gave the term to the 5 families of Dorje Shugden as being Shugden Ringa. Is there anything you can add to this?
Yeah, the term is used by this great master in the Sakya school, and it was later used by Serkong Dorje Chang, who is a High Lama of the Gelug school, for his fulfillment ritual to Dorje Shugden, or the puja text to Dorje Shugden. And then later on, Kapcha Pabongka Rinpoche also used this term in his fulfillment text to propitiate Dorje Shugden as well. So you can see that from this term is used in the Sakya school has now been incorporated in the Gelug school as well.
So based on what has been explained to me by the two of you, it seems that the Sakya Trinzins had a very close connection with Dorje Shugden, starting with the 30th and the 31st. Now, Martin, are there any other Sakya Trinzins who have had a similarly close connection with Dorje Shugden and with Dorje Shugden's practice?
Yes, there were. We know about Mochen Kunga Lundrup, we know about the 30th and 31st. Now, the 33rd and 35th Sakya throne holder, Sakya Trinzins, they were both very clear in their writings that acknowledged Dorje Shugden as an enlightened being. And when we come to the 37th Sakya Trinzin, Kunga Ningpo, he too was regarded as an emanation of Dorje Shugden. Following on from that, the 39th Sakya Trinzin, Drakshu Trinle Rinchen, actually regarded Dorje Shugden as being of the same nature as Avalokiteshvara or Chenrezig. So you see, there is in fact a very, very close connection between the Sakyas, especially the Sakya throne holders, and the protector Dorje Shugden.
All right, so for the benefit of our listeners, let me just recap what both of you have said, that from the 18th century onwards, beginning with Mochen Kunga Lundrup, the Sakyas regarded Dorje Shugden as an enlightened being. And in fact, Mochen Kunga Lundrup composed a Sakya Kangsul or prayer to invoke upon the blessings and protection of Dorje Shugden. Then it was mentioned that the Sakya Trinzins had a very close connection with Dorje Shugden, that the 30th, 31st, 33rd, 35th, 37th and 39th Sakya Trinzins all regarded Dorje Shugden as being an enlightened being. The 30th Sakya Trinzin, Sonam Rinchen, he was actually a great practitioner, great propitiator, promoter of Dorje Shugden. He passed on the transmissions of the practices to his son, the 31st Sakya Trinzin, who also compiled these rituals and practiced Dorje Shugden very strongly. It was mentioned that the 33rd and 35th Sakya Trinzins or Sakya throne holders mentioned very clearly in their writings that Dorje Shugden is an enlightened being. And then moving on from there, Martin, you had mentioned that the 37th Sakya Trinzin had also been regarded as an emanation of Dorje Shugden. And lastly, it was mentioned by you that the 39th Sakya Trinzin, Drakshu Trinle Rinchen, was said to have regarded Dorje Shugden as being one in nature with Avalokiteshvara or Chenrezig. So we've covered the Sakya tradition and their view of Dorje Shugden pretty extensively. I feel that it's only fair that we discuss next the Kagyus and their relationship with Dorje Shugden.
Actually, I know of a Kagyu Lama by the name of Jigme Nobu Shabdrung, and he composed a prayer to Dorje Shugden together with all the other Dharma protectors like Mahakala, Shinkongma, Cheringchenga, and Pelden Lamo, and all these Dharma protectors. And these are all in his collected works of the 4th Shabdrung Tuku of Bhutan. And you can see that because of this, Dorje Shugden is definitely propitiated and worshipped in the Kagyu school. If there's one Tuku, there must be other Kagyu Tukus that have composed practices to Dorje Shugden as well.
Pastor David, it's interesting that you mentioned that there may be other teachers within the Kagyu tradition who propitiated and promoted Dorje Shugden as part of the Kagyu pantheon of protectors, the Kagyu set of practices which invoke upon the protection and blessings of Dorje Shugden as one of their protectors. Now, I know that within the Kagyu tradition that there are many different schools of thought and different practices and lineages, and that, in fact, I heard that with the Drukpa Kagyus, they have a close connection with Dorje Shugden.
That's correct. Sekam Dorje Shang said that one of the earliest and most significant rituals written to Dorje Shugden, a text known as Petition to Dorje Shugden Cell granting all desired activities, was probably co-written by the Sakya master Mochen Kunga Lundrup, whom we spoke of earlier, and a Kagyu master who was the third Drule incarnation by the name of Drupwang Tenzing Zangpo. So you see again that there's a Kagyu influence together with the Sakya influence. Now, Sekam Dorje Shang would then incorporate this ritual into his very, very extensive works and texts on Dorje Shugden. So again, that we see that what we have today in terms of texts and liturgies that we are using today in our practice of Dorje Shugden has very strong influence and very strong contributions from the Sakyas and the Kagyus that we maintain in our practice today.
Martin, it's very interesting what you mentioned about the Gelug rituals having strong contributions from both the Sakya and the Kagyu schools. Now, we've talked a great deal about the Sakya and the Kagyu influences on what is currently a Gelug practice, or what is considered a Gelug practice of Dorje Shugden. What about the fourth school of Tibetan Buddhism, Pastor David? Does the Nyingma school have any connection, any relationship with Dorje Shugden and Dorje Shugden's practice?
There's actually very few written records left, but there's one antique tanka of Dorje Shugden with Guru Rinpoche, the lineage holder of the Nyingmas. And that shows a very clear relationship that the Nyingmas practice Dorje Shugden. There's also records from monks, elderly monks from Pegaling Monastery, who said that the lay practitioners, the Nyingma practitioners surrounding the monastery in Tibet, had mentioned that they practice Dorje Shugden although they are Nyingmas, and they had no problems whatsoever with the practice of Guru Rinpoche and Dorje Shugden. So for the Nyingmas, it's not a problem practicing Dorje Shugden, so there's nothing sectarian about that.
So far, we've discussed the practice background, the reliance on Dorje Shugden with the different traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, with the different lineages of Tibetan Buddhism. And we've seen that there is a great history of propitiation and invocation of Dorje Shugden with the Kagyu Nyingma, definitely the Sakya schools of Buddhism, and now, as we see, with the Gelug tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. We are actually in a panel discussion about the accusations that have been directed against Dorje Shugden practice as being sectarian, but we've never actually examined or discussed the actual definition of sectarian. I have here with me 3 definitions of sectarianism. The first is a narrow-minded adherence to a particular sect, party, or denomination. Pastor David, what are your thoughts on this? Can this definition of sectarianism be applied to the practice of Dorje Shugden?
There's actually nothing narrow-minded about Dorje practice, because as we already examined, that Dorje Shugden is actually practiced by the Sakyas, by the Kagyus, by the Nyingmas. So it doesn't apply in this case that Dorje practice is sectarian or narrow-minded.
So Pastor David has just explained to us why the first definition of sectarianism cannot be applied to the practice of Dorje Shugden. With our second definition, sectarianism is defined as bigotry, discrimination, or hatred arising from attaching importance to perceived differences between subdivisions within a group, such as between different denominations of a religion, class, regional, or factions of a political movement. Martin, what do you think about this definition, and can this definition of sectarianism be applied to the practice of Dorje Shugden?
Well, actually, Pastor Gina, it's very interesting that you should ask me that question. And I would say the answer is no, because by this second definition of sectarianism, the focus is on words like hatred, discrimination, bigotry, focusing on perceived differences. And when you think about it, we have already heard how the Dorje Shugden practice today owes even a lot to contributions from non-Gelugpa masters, from Sakya masters, from Kagyu masters, and they have written works which we continue to use today in our Dorje Shugden text in our council. So the practice that we hold, that Dorje Shugden practice holds so sacred today, contain such treasured and significant components written by non-Gelugpa practitioners, non-Gelugpa masters. So it is absurd to say that on the one hand, we regard what we have here as holy, and what we have here, which is very, very well treasured, are works of masters who are non-Gelugpas, and their works are being considered, are still being used. It is absurd to say that on the one hand, and on the other hand, to feel any discrimination or hatred towards the very people who gave us our practice today. It is quite contradictory. But you see, what is interesting is that this perceived difference, perceived because there actually isn't any real differences as such. Before the Dorje Shugden conflict, before there was even any controversy surrounding the practice, there were no such things as Shugden Gelugpas and non-Shugden Gelugpas. It was just, they were all Gelugpas. And whether one practiced Dorje Shugden or not was not a matter of any great importance. It's just, in fact, a very small part of the entire Gelugpa lineage practice. It is like if you prefer to propitiate Tara and another deity, it is just what we do. It didn't have any bearing on the fact that just because we are not worshipping the same deity, that we would now be different, that I'm no longer Gelugpa or you're no longer Gelugpa. That issue never arose. Now, the question of perceived differences, it is perceived because in fact there are no such real differences as such. The question of perceived differences only arose after the conflict. And in fact, it was the people who opposed the Dorje Shugden practice today that created the perception of a difference. I say created because, again, there were, and there remain to be no differences as such, okay? That it is those people who then says, look, there are all these differences, and that because of differences, Shugden practitioners have a sense of bigotry, of a sense of prejudice, have a sense of anger towards those who don't practice. In fact, the opposite is true. If we want to be a bit more accurate, it is those who oppose the Dorje Shugden practice who feels this animosity, if you like, who feels this anger at Dorje Shugden practitioners for refusing to give up a practice. You would never hear, and you have never heard of Dorje Shugden practitioners or monks or high lamas going out to forcibly convert people to become Dorje Shugden practitioners. It's just unheard of. But on the other hand, what you see here today are people who are critics of the practice, who are doing quite a bit, taking quite a lot of efforts to try and convert Dorje Shugden practitioners away from their practice. So if there's any sense of prejudice, discrimination, any sense of hatred and anger, if you like, and if there's anyone who is focusing on perceived differences, it is definitely not Dorje Shugden practitioners. On the other hand, it's very clearly those who oppose the practice of Dorje Shugden. So I would say, no, definitely this definition of sectarianism does not apply to Dorje Shugden practitioners at all.
Martin has just explained why the second definition of sectarianism cannot be applied to Dorje Shugden practitioners or Dorje Shugden practice. And in fact, perhaps it may even apply to critics of Dorje Shugden's practice for focusing on the perceived differences between the practices. Now we come to our third definition of sectarianism, where it is defined as the religious or political sects and the differences between them. How about this definition, Martin? This third definition of sectarianism, can it be applied to Dorje Shugden practice and to Dorje Shugden practitioners?
Look, society has always organized itself into groups, into schools, into divisions, into lineages, into sects. That has always been the case, and it's not only in religion. You see that in politics, you see that in different schools of philosophy, you see that in music, you see that in art, whether you call it genre, whether you call it, whatever you call it, it is very common for society to organize themselves into agreed groups. So in Buddhism, you have the Hinayana, then you have the Mahayana, and within the Mahayana, you have the Chinese Mahayanis, and then you have the Japanese Mahayanis, and then of course you have the Tibetan Buddhism, which is Vajrayana. Now, you cannot say that any of these schools are sectarian. In fact, what really is going on is that the Hinayana, for example, the Hinayana Buddhists are just merely focusing on a certain path, a certain method that has been established over time. And it is a method that has been established and proven, if you like. And the masters of that particular lineage or sect are trained to teach and to cultivate our minds according to that particular method. And merely by choosing to remain with one method, to remain with one established path or system of learning and practicing Dharma, doesn't and cannot make you sectarian. You cannot go to a Buddhist of the Hinayana school and say, hey, why don't you incorporate some Tantra, some Vajrayana Tantra? Why don't you incorporate some of the visualizations, some of the rituals that the Vajrayana Buddhists do into your practice? And if you don't, you're sectarian. It just doesn't wash. It is not fair and it is not right. So again, to say that Dorje Shugden practitioners are sectarian is wrong. They are just merely following a method, an established path. So no, I would say that if you were to say that are Dorje Shugden practitioners sectarian, then I would say by the third definition, they are as sectarian or as non-sectarian as anyone else, as any other schools, be it in religion, be it in music, be it in business, be it in politics. And coming back to these, they are just as sectarian or non-sectarian as the Nyingmas, as the Kagyus, as the different schools within the Kagyus, that all are merely following a set path, a path that is set by them, by the lineage masters.
So it has already been explained that according to the dictionary definitions of sectarianism, that this term cannot be accurately or fairly applied to Dorje Shugden's practice and to devotees of the practice, that it would be inaccurate to do so. It's also been mentioned by both of you gentlemen that historically, Dorje Shugden's practice has had many significant contributions from masters of other traditions, from the Sakya, Nyingma, Kagyu schools. And scripturally, Martin, you had briefly mentioned that it's not incorrect or wrong to encourage students to focus on just a few practices to prevent the development of wrong view and also to prevent spiritual confusion, because in our state as unattained practitioners, we may not necessarily have the ability or the wisdom to discern between presentation and the essence of the teachings. Now, Pastor David, why would people automatically assume that to be sectarian or to focus on just a few practices is bad?
No, it's not necessarily bad, because actually, you see, in Buddhism, the Buddha himself actually taught many, many different sets of teachings, and his intention was actually to address the needs of the practitioner themselves. So it is just people misconstruing the meaning of devoting towards one particular tradition. For example, like there's the beautiful Theravadan tradition of Southern Asia, like Sri Lanka, Thailand, and then there's the Mahayana traditions of China, Korea, Japan, Tibet, and in the Vajrayana traditions of Tibet and Mongolia. These are separate traditions that has evolved through specific instructions from the Buddha, specific teachings from the Buddha. So it's not necessarily bad, it's just that people have misconstrued the meaning and behind these differences, because these differences are actually meant to benefit a specific set of disciples.
So based on what Pastor David has just explained, can anything positive or will anything negative arise from mixing lineages, mixing teachings, mixing practices from the different lineages?
Well, I can't speak for very highly attained masters, and I can't speak for enlightened minds. But for me, for an ordinary practitioner like me, and I suspect most of the practitioners out there, I would not be able to tell the subtleties between how various teachings are presented to me and the essence or essences that I'm supposed to realize. It will be very difficult for me. And therefore, for ordinary practitioners like me, having one guru, one lineage, and one method, one established method for that matter, would certainly help me in my practice and avoid confusion. And what is interesting is for us to examine before I even go and dabble in other teachings of other lineages, I must first look at what is before me, which is itself is so vast that why should I go and dabble in other things before I've totally studied, applied, understood, realized, and derived the benefits, the essence from the lineage that is laid out to me. That before I even master this particular lineage, I really have no business going out there and asking for other teachings or wanting to dabble in other methods, because that would only confuse the whole practice. And this is common sense. And therefore, it is not the question of whether the practice is sectarian or not sectarian should not even arise. The objective of a practice is not to do as many different practices and see as many different masters as possible. The final objective, the ultimate objective of a Dharma practice is to attain liberation, is to attain the state of enlightenment. So, shouldn't we just follow the system and the method that is being laid out, that, as I've said before, that has been proven? Surely that must be the ultimate objective, to go through this particular method to the end and to have the realization that the method is actually designed to provide.
So Martin, you've talked about was from the perspective of an unenlightened mind, an ordinary practitioner. But for an enlightened being like Lama Tsongkhapa, it's a different thing altogether, because for Lama Tsongkhapa, he's not an ordinary being. Many great masters consider him an enlightened being, and not just within the Gelug tradition, also with other traditions like even the Karmapa. So on top of that, he has taken a lot of teachings from various traditions, and his intention was not that he was to mix the traditions. His intention was because he was so devoted to the study and practice that he actually mastered all the teachings, mastered all the practices of each teacher, and then moving on one to another, he was able to distill all these teachings and practices and able to disseminate to his students. So it's not a matter of being sectarian or not sectarian in this case, but because for someone like Lama Tsongkhapa, an enlightened being, what he was able to do was he was able to devote himself to every single tradition. This is not to be done for ordinary practitioners. This is for an extraordinary being like Lama Tsongkhapa. In essence, Lama Tsongkhapa actually taken all these lineages and practices from the Sakya, the Kagyu, the Nyingma, and distilled it into its most potent form and disseminated it to his students. And from that, his students have developed it into what is now known as the Gelug tradition. So the Gelug tradition is not sectarian. And then the Dharma Protector of the Gelug tradition, as recognized today, is Dorje Shugden. So how can Dorje Shugden be sectarian? Since Dorje Shugden actually protects the essence of all these traditions, the Sakya, the Kagyu, the Nyingmas.
Martin, you mentioned earlier that other lineages and the way that they rely upon their Dharma protectors and the way that they rely upon their deities, in fact, is no different to the way that the Gelug practitioners would rely upon their deities as a focal point of their practice to prevent spiritual confusion and to prevent the development of wrong view. Now, Pastor David, are there other traditions where such similar practices are upheld, where these traditions have their own specific set of Dharma protectors?
Okay, actually, it's not uncommon for other traditions to have their own Dharma protectors. Therefore, Dorje Shugden being the protector of the Gelug tradition is not unique of the Gelugs. I'll give you some examples here. For example, for the Karma Kagyus, they have the four-arm Mahakala. For the Drikung Kagyu, they have the Achi Choki Droma. And for the Shangpa Kagyu, they have the six-arm Mahakala. And finally, For the Nyingmas, they have the special protectress of their tradition with one eye, one breast, and one teeth, who is known as Ekajati. So therefore, if you were to say that Dorje Shugden is sectarian just because he is the protector of the Gelug tradition, then all these other traditions that have their own individual protectors of their tradition, of their respective tradition, would be sectarian too.
And actually to add to that, seeing that the accusation of Shugden practitioners being sectarian, you would never hear of Dorje Shugden practitioners going out there to tell the Nyingma paths that, look, drop Ekajati and instead take up Dorje Shugden, otherwise you're sectarian. And so if Dorje Shugden is accused of being sectarian, or the practice is accused of being sectarian, why don't you say that Ekajati is similarly sectarian? And all these others. Why is it only Dorje Shugden that the focus has been put on and to be accused of being sectarian for merely protecting the lineage it arose to protect?
A panel discussion about Dorje Shugden's practice and its supposed sectarian nature will not be complete without discussing the Lama who has had the most accusations of sectarianism directed against him. I'm sure you know who I'm talking about, His Holiness Kyabje Pabongka Dorje Chang. Critics of Shugden practice regularly accuse Kyabje Pabongka Rinpoche of being sectarian, of his teachings being sectarian. Pastor David, how would you respond to people who direct such accusations against Kyabje Pabongka Rinpoche? How would you respond to accusations that His Holiness Pabongka Rinpoche is sectarian?
Oh, I would say that it's absurd, because you have to look into Kyabje Pabongka Rinpoche's context in his life. During his lifetime, Kyabje Pabongka Rinpoche was extremely popular among monastics and monks and also of lay people. And his tremendous fame has encouraged, or rather created some people to be extremely jealous. And some quarters have made rumors, especially against Kyabje Pabongka Rinpoche, because he was basically considered like a threat. In fact, Geshe Lundro Sopa, who is a direct disciple of Kyabje Pabongka Rinpoche, wrote in his autobiography, Like a Waking Dream, that the teachings of Kyabje Pabongka Rinpoche was misunderstood and taken out of context. That actually the meaning of Kyabje Pabongka Rinpoche's teachings was not sectarian, it was just misconstrued. Okay, in addition to that, Kyabje Pabongka Rinpoche taught in his teachings called Liberation in the Palm of Your Hands, which was written into a book by Kyabje Chajang Rinpoche, clearly states that mixing of traditions or taking one tradition and belittling another is one of the downfalls. So it clearly indicates that Kyabje Pabongka Rinpoche was not sectarian. So actually, a lot of the rumors surrounding Kyabje Pabongka Rinpoche of his sectarian teachings, so-called, is actually meant to defame him and put Kyabje Pabongka Rinpoche down, probably because he was extremely popular.
Pastor David, Martin, thank you for joining us here today. Let me recap what both of you gentlemen have said for the benefit of our listeners. Dorje Shugden did not start out as a Gelug protector, but actually as a Sakya protector. As we have discovered with an analysis of the different lineages, Dorje Shugden's history clearly demonstrates that his practice is not exclusively Gelug. Every aspect of his practice has had contributions, significant contributions from other lineages. It has also been said that if Dorje Shugden is a Gelug protector, well, the Gelugs themselves are not sectarian. The founder of the Gelug tradition, Lama Tsongkhapa himself, was extremely non-sectarian. The Gelug tradition, formed from the teachings of Lama Tsongkhapa, are a combination of teachings from all of the other traditions. Tsongkhapa himself had masters from other traditions, for example, Rendawa, who was a Sakya master. We also looked into the reincarnation masters and the lineage masters of Dorje Shugden. And Pastor David, Martin, you have shown that these masters were not exclusively Gelug. We also examined the definition of sectarian and sectarianism, and we found that in this matter of Dorje Shugden's practice, none of these definitions really apply. Therefore, we can safely conclude that no, Dorje Shugden's practice is not sectarian. For anyone to suggest otherwise, is to paint an untrue and inaccurate portrayal of Dorje Shugden. In falsely labeling Dorje Shugden and his practice as sectarian, critics of Shugden's practice seek to discourage people from making a connection with this wisdom Buddha. Thus, for those who do not know the true meaning and nature of Dorje Shugden, it is easy to see how alarmist words like sectarian can result in panic, wrong view, and spiritual confusion. Is it fair to discourage people from engaging in a true Dharma path that has an authentic and authenticated lineage? Is it compassionate to do so? Is it dharmic to do so? We hope and we request for critics of Shugden's practice to consider the results of their words and their proclamations, and to consider the pain and the suffering they have caused in falsely labeling Shugden's practice and his practitioners as sectarian. Thank you for joining us here today. We hope this panel discussion has been as enlightening for you as it has been for us.